Okay, I think I'm going to just make a little bit of a start. It's a very informal morning where we'll have some informal presentations. There will be PowerPoint presentations, so you can't kind of quite get away from the formality of that. But essentially, hopefully, the idea is just to remind those of you who are very familiar with the ideas of natural inclusion and natural inclusionality, what it's all about. For some of you who are less familiar, maybe to visit it for the first time, or see me try to explain it for the first time. And it's really lovely to have such a diverse gathering of people here. We've got every walk of human life here, in terms of a range from outright artists and architects to outright biological scientists to outright management types to outright educationalists. So very, very nice range, and reflecting the fact that I think natural inclusionality as a way of thinking applies to all human endeavours, because fundamentally it reaches to the basic way we think, the basic way we think about or view reality, the basic kinds of logic that we use when we're thinking about ourselves and when we're thinking about reality and the nature of nature and the nature of human nature. So those are sort of the ideas that are going to be around. Several of us will be contributing. More of us, I'm hoping, will appear during the morning. And I suspect several people have already got lost one way or another in the rabbit warren that is Bath University. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of start. Today the emphasis is going to be on science. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about social organisation, the social implications, more than about the science, although this evening Phil Tattersall, who hopefully will arrive, having come all the way here from Tasmania, will actually begin to sort of show how we make the bridge between the scientific understanding of the world and reality and what it means for us socially and psychologically as human beings. The painting here that this first slide shows is one which I did when I was a vibrant young man, aged 24, in 1974. And it astonishes me now because I didn't know what on earth I was painting. It came straight out of my unconscious mind. The way I paint is that I see an image in my mind. It just comes into my mind in a flash, and I then paint it with a little bit of adding a few frills along the way. But the basic image, whenever I do a painting, just comes into my mind in a moment, in a vision. And I had this particular vision, and I represented two cliff faces opposing one another across a chasm, and that we had warring armies coming down from the left side and the right side into confrontation with one another. From the left side, we had an army represented by hawks, which have binocular vision and are predatory birds, and they see the world in a very tunnel-visioned way, which enables them to pick out prey, essentially. And we too, as human beings, are binocular visioned. We're a bit like hawks in that way. We have eyes on the front of our faces. We don't have panoramic vision. And so, especially when the way we think and view the world is dominated by our eyesight, we see the world in a very, very detached and analytical way, a sharp, focused way, in much the same way as hawks do. Coming in from the left-hand side, we've got swans. Swans have eyes on the sides of their heads. They have panoramic vision. They have all-round vision, which actually makes them very kind of defensive. Herbivorous animals are always potentially prey for predatory animals, and the need for the panoramic vision is very important. But somehow these are coming into confrontation with one another. But we have a bridge across the chasm, which is represented by, in Jungian terms, the classical anima, the female archetype, whose hair forms a veil across the chasm. Coming through the middle is a shell, a rowing shell, an empty boat, an empty rowing boat, which with the oars at rest, which is somehow trying to negotiate through this chasm between the opposing sides. And as that boat crosses through the veil, it comes out into the open. Meanwhile, we've got a sun at the top there with a sword of Damocles coming down, which is doing everything it can to cut through the middle channel. Now, I had no idea at that time that I painted this of what we now know about the structure of the human brain. The left hemisphere, which is associated with analytical thought and the expression of language. The right hemisphere, which is associated with all-round thought, sort of circumspect vision, putting things together in the moment. That's the right hemisphere. The corpus callosum, the living bridge that allows the left and the right hemisphere, potentially at least, to talk to one another and hear what each other has to say to one another. But the great danger is that if we cut through that bridge in one way or another, then one or the other vision may dominate. So we may get a split in the way we think, or in the human world, between the analytical scientific type and the holistic artistic type, and they come into confrontation with one another. And somehow, but somehow, the nature of natural inclusionality is to find the way through the middle. It really is the middle way, the middle path that brings, instead of having each and the other in opposition, has each and the other in each other's, working in one another's influence and being combined as the way that we make our way through life, using both an all-round view of the world and a focused way of the world, and seeing how those are necessarily integrated in the way we understand the world. So,
sorry, Alan.
Yeah?
It's just Phil. He's in the centre of Bath.
Right.
When are you expecting him to talk? Are you?
He can talk whenever he likes.
Okay, Phil.
He can talk after we've talked, but he can just make his way up here and find.
Okay, Alan started.
Yeah.
So
okay.
you
That's fine.
come up with anything, okay?
Yeah. We will look forward to the Tasmanian ingress later on. So, if we just sort of think about those opposing ways of seeing the world, and then we think about the way we've all been brought up to think, and the kind of logic that we've all been introduced to from an early age onwards at school, if you like, had inculcated into us. And it is the logic of opposition. It's exactly the logic that is represented by those two opposing cliffs of either this way or that way. Either you're with me or you're against me, kind of logic. And if we don't have contradiction, then we must be all one. Yeah? All together. In a kind of seamless whole. So what we've all been brought up with from the time of Aristotle onwards, or earlier really, is the definitive logic of many. Either we have many in opposition, or we have one which is complete in itself. Those two worldviews. The feature of both these worldviews, holistic and reductionistic, if you like, is that they have a particular way of viewing space and boundaries. A very particular way, I see it in terms of particles even. So boundaries in this logic, in this definitive logic, are perceived as discrete limits, beginnings and endings, where one thing ends and another begins. So they are cut-off points, or cut-off places. Space, on the other hand, is seen as empty distance, that which comes between, things. So we have this predominant way of thinking about the world. And it influences just about every sort of concept, especially scientific concept, that has emerged right up until the present time. And here is a demonstration of it, which I only came across about 6 months ago, when Phil Tattersall, actually, who's on his way here, actually said, "You better read some Einstein, Alan." So he sent me some Einstein to read. And he said, "You look at this particular page. I think this is where Einstein was reaching for inclusionality." So I read this passage. When a smaller box, small s, is a part of the hollow space of big S, and the same space which contains both of them belongs to each of the boxes. When small s is in motion with respect to big S, however, the concept is less simple. One is then inclined to think that small s encloses always the same space, but a variable part of the space big S. It then becomes necessary to apportion to each box its particular space, not thought of as bounded, and to assume that these two space ends are in motion with respect to each other. That basic idea of the relationship between a larger space and a smaller space is a foundational to both special and general relativity. So what was he really saying? This is what he is envisaging, that somehow we have a larger box, which to even think about it, we have to put a boundary around it, to display it visually, we have to put a boundary around it. And we have a smaller box which we have to put a boundary around it, but we must ignore the boundaries because we don't want to have those boundaries. And then we're thinking about somehow what happens when the smaller box moves relative to the large box. And the question is, how on earth can this make sense? How can you move, in effect, cut and paste a box of space without dynamically bounding it? How can you do that? How can you move a block of space if it's not bounded? If it is bounded, and if it's dynamically bounded, how can you dynamically bound it, or bound this box, or in fact, more aptly, we should be thinking about a sphere, without a gravitational centre, something which is drawing, which is an attractor for the formation of a boundary, around some inner core? How can you do that? How can you distinguish the space inside a box from the space outside and still transmit light from an external source through the interior of the box at a constant speed, regardless of the movement of the box relative to its surroundings? That is at the heart of the development of the idea of special relativity. The idea that somehow or other the speed of light inside a transparent box is held constant even when that box is moving towards the light source. So you can imagine this box moving towards that light source. Now our analytical minds will say the speed of light to get through the box is going to go increase as the box moves towards the light source. But it doesn't. And that is an observation which has been made time and time again. Somehow the transparent box of space carries its light with it relative to what's going on outside, and that's what gives rise to the Doppler effect, the Doppler shift effect. The famous redshift, for example, which is associated or has given rise to the Big Bang theory of cosmology. Meanwhile, we're still thinking, but if space is a continuous, frictionless, intangible presence, how can you subdivide it in the first place? How can you cut that which can't be cut? That which has no resistance, no friction, no pressure? How can you do that? So if we think these questions through, we come to realise that the poets have always been right. Here's an example of a famous poet who said something which I find almost indisputable and which is actually right in the heart of our understanding of natural inclusionality. In nature, everything is distinct, meaning distinguishable, dynamically distinguishable. Yet nothing defined into absolute, independent singleness. Nothing is alone. Nothing is absolutely isolated from anything else. Yeah? So in other words, you cannot cut, confine, exclude, or occupy space if we understand space to be an intangible, frictionless, pressureless presence. You can only dynamically configure space into distinct localities. That's all you can do. So you can dynamically configure space into distinctive localities, but those localities cannot be the space inside those localities cannot be isolated from the outside of those localities. And indeed, when you think about it, when I'm moving, our eyes seem to tell us that I'm moving through space, cutting a swathe through space. The reality is space is slipping through me because it can't be cut. It's intangible. Yeah? So we have a very different sort of sense of relativity, yeah? Where space stays where it is, but movement implies, in a relative sense, that space is rushing through me. Yeah? And the faster I rush, the faster space rushes through me. But space isn't a substantial presence. Yeah? It's intangible. So that's kind of really significant and really important. It's really important because it leads to what I call a whole new way of thinking, which is the way of thinking of natural inclusionality. Where we understand now, here, central feature of this, we understand space as a continuous, limitless, receptive pool of intangible presence throughout and beyond the boundaries of all figural forms. Space is universal transparency, universal darkness, universal silence. Boundaries are energetic interfacings that make figural form dynamically distinguishable, but not isolated. And what this means is that we move out of the definitive boundary logic that we've had for thousands of years, which leads to paradoxical contradiction, a contradiction of one and or the otherness in opposition, to a fluid boundary logic of evolutionary co-creativity, where we understand each in the other, yeah? Or each in the otherness. Yeah? The energy within the space within the energy. Yeah? So we have each in the otherness, not one or the otherness, or even both one and the otherness in mutual contradiction. And where this leads us, or leads us further, some of you have seen me do this, and I'll probably do it again tomorrow morning in a different context, is to think about relationships between figures. That energetically configured figures and their spatial context and with one another. So a way of thinking about this, if you imagine it, is to imagine you have in front of you an infinite sheet of paper, yeah? A limitless sheet of paper. Okay? That can represent space everywhere, or omnispace, without limit, infinite, true infinity. And you're trying to think, okay, how can I distinguish a figure within this space? Well, you can take some light or energy, yes, in the form of a pen or some ink or pigment, and you can start to dynamically configure a figure. You could draw an outline, say, of a gingerbread man. Yeah. which is what I've done there. You might draw an outline of another gingerbread man next door. And what we've done here, the very process of drawing that dotted line around the figure is dynamic. Yeah? So you've dynamically or energetically configured the figure as a local energetic configuration of space everywhere. And now suddenly we realise that we've got this space everywhere, but there are distinctive regions of space that we can talk about. There is a region within the figure, which we can call intra-space, which just means within. There's a space between the two figures, which we can call interspace, which is just the space between. There's a space everywhere, which we'll call omnispace. There's a space beyond the figures, which we might call extra-space. But most importantly of all, and what rationalistic logic overlooks, is that there is the space throughout the figures, the space that goes straight through the boundaries. Yeah, because the boundaries are not cutting space. Yeah, so the space is continuous straight through the boundary. Space is continuous straight through that wall there. Straight through me. It cannot be disrupted because it's a presence everywhere. Okay, we might then think about bringing those figures into proximity with one another so that they might make contact. Okay, so and making physical, tangible contact is what I call making a connection. Okay, it means to make tangible contact with another tangible form. Yeah, and when you make tangible contact with another tangible form, you may hold on to one another, in which case you're connected. Okay, before that you're not. You're in a common pool of space everywhere, and you're not isolated from the other figure. I'm not isolated from Greta at this moment, but I'm not yet connected at this stage when we shake hands. We're connected, and now we're not connected in a tangible sense. And in fact, we can almost take this even further in that we recognize that boundaries themselves, being energetic, are not rigid and permanent. They themselves can coalesce and separate off from one another. So another possibility might be, human beings can't really do this. It's what some Native Americans try to do, the idea of cutting yourself so that you, in effect, form a blood brothership with your neighbour. Yes? The idea is that somehow you've coalesced your outer boundaries so that your inner spaces become common. So we might theoretically have this kind of a situation where we now have two figures with common internal space. And when we have common internal space, the figures have effectively opened up a communication channel, between themselves. Okay, so that we're talking about the opening of a communication channel. I'm not just shaking Greta by the hand, in a vibration. But I'm actually, we truly are on the same flow length. We've opened up literally to one another, so that there is internal communication of a sort going on between us. And this is not just a silly idea, it really happens in the organisms that I spent a lot of time studying, the fungi, which live their lives as systems or collective systems of microscopic tubes filled with protoplasm. These tubes grow at their tips and they branch. A feature of many fungi is this extraordinary phenomenon of hyphal fusion. And without this phenomenon, no fungi could form a mushroom. Okay? You have to be able to do this in order to be able to produce a mushroom out of the mycelium. Okay, so, and here's a series of images showing it happening. You see the hyphal branch there, home towards another hyphal along there. Here they've come into contact, so they're shaking hands. They're stuck to one another, but in this part here, the boundaries have opened up so that their internal protoplasm has become continuous. They're now forming a true communications network, a network which is a labyrinth of space, and the possibilities of flow within them is opened up. In this particular example, we put a little partition across at the end of this so that we can vary the flow. Yeah? It will use a kind of valve. So where does this lead us? It leads us to a new, what I might call a new physicality, a new understanding of physical reality. And if you've got a new understanding of physical reality, it's going to affect everything. You do everything where you think just a lot. Yeah? So this is why it's so significant across all human endeavours, not just in the scientific world. We now have a physicality that doesn't split or deem it necessary to posit the independent existence of tangible form, tangible energetic form, free from the receptive influence, because that which has no resistance is receptive. Yeah? It welcomes in. Yeah? There's no friction. So we don't have to posit the independent existence of the tangible free from the receptive influence of the intangible, or vice versa. The Cartesian split, Cartesian dualism is gone. And that is the split which has divided the world and divided the hemispheres for thousands of years. The split between the tangible and the intangible. We now move on from what atomic theory spent so long trying to convince us in, the idea that reality consists of points of mass surrounded by space, yeah? Which is what the whole of conventional mathematics is based on, to thinking about points of space, yeah, the space within the intraspace, enveloped or surfaced by an energetic interfacing or lining. So we move from embedding the form and movements of material objects in the hidden connections and lines of force of structured space of a field, which is basically what Einstein's way of thinking about relativity is, and also related to the quantum mechanical view. We move from that way of thinking to an appreciation of natural inclusion as the co-creative, fluid dynamic transformation of all through all in a limitless pool of receptive, inductive, drawing into itself spatial influence, spatial context. So we have this world of natural inclusion, which I find the metaphor of the river a beautiful expression of, where essentially everything is in the influence of everything else. Yeah? And we understand that the flow of the river is an expression of the landscape. Yeah? And the flow of the river shapes the landscape just as much as the landscape shapes the flow of the river. Yeah? And our eyes, of course, deceive us with rivers. When we look at the banks of a river, we think the water stops at the edge. Just in the same way that our eyes make us think space stops at our skins and starts again inside. Yeah? It doesn't. Continuous, straight through, continuous with the water table. And so we have this very, very different idea of evolutionary dynamics, of what I call natural inclusion as the co-creative, fluid dynamic transformation of all through all in receptive spatial context. We realize that no figure is all one or alone. There is no such thing as an absolute independent singleness. That absolute independent singleness is the basis for all rational thought, or objective rational thought, is that the notion of the independent singleness. I spent yesterday morning watching the 3 episodes of a series on BBC Two. What was the title of it? It was All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, in which And those 3 episodes show very clearly how the basic idea of the independent singleness has been the fundamental idea which has produced the conflicting world that we live in today. And it talked about some of the heroes of that independent singleness view. Ayn Rand, who developed the essential idea of pure selfishness, which was then followed up by further heroes, Bill Hamilton and Richard Dawkins, who developed the idea of the selfish gene and sees that selfish gene as our internal controller, ensuring that we behave in opposition to one another in the world. These are our modern heroes, and their thinking, in my mind, is based on a fundamental logical error. And we're living the consequences of it. So we essentially begin to realize that no figure is all one or alone. And this is a painting of mine, which is based on the song Green Grove the Rushes O, whose ultimate line is, "One is one and all alone, and evermore shall be so." And this is saying, no, it damn well isn't. And we're beginning also to understand a different way of thinking about numbers, because our rational way of thinking about numbers have always been these atomic point masses, discrete singularities. And what we're now saying is, no number is alone. If we think about the number 2, it includes what? If we it's becoming 3. So we might start thinking, instead of thinking about the number 2 as an isolated pair, somehow a couple all alone in the world, we see the number 2 has 1 flowing into it and 3 a sort of dynamic relationship between the number itself, where it's come from, and what it's becoming. And we emerge into a different way of thinking about numbers as flow forms, with neighbourhoods. The funny thing about the number 1 in mathematics is it has no neighbourhood. It's all alone, and evermore shall be so. So how on earth can it ever make 2? And the answer is it can't. And that's why 1 squared plus 1 squared is not the same as 1 plus 1 squared. In other words, 1 squared plus 1 squared is 2. 1 plus 1 squared is 4. And essentially that difference is related implicitly to the idea of the inclusion of 2 ones in a common space. That's what, when we put brackets around a mathematical equation, effectively what we're doing is saying this is a couple, not a singularity. They're a couple in common space. It sort of leads us to a completely new way of thinking about natural geometry, which Ben will talk about a little bit later on, in which we think of the true geometry of fluid flow, the natural geometry of fluid flow, or what I like to call the flow geometry of space, where we move out of classical geometries of Euclid, which of course, once again, the split between the matter and the space, the discontinuity, or indeed the geometries of Riemann and Lobachevsky, which are basically the geometries of the outside of a sphere or the inside curvature of a sphere. And we start to understand that the fundamental natural geometry is all about the basic form that you get when you energetically configure space is spherical, because it has minimal surface area in relation to volume. Okay, so, but that, when you think of a sphere, our minds always think of the sphere as sort of ending at its boundary, instead of thinking about the sphere as a spherical configuration of space everywhere. So you have to get out of thinking about the tennis ball as a discrete particle, to think about the tennis ball as an inclusion of space. Everywhere. And if you do that, and you think about how energetic spheres might relate to one another as they come into proximity and coalesce, then we understand the opening up of a potential for reciprocal flow in two directions, yeah, amongst these spherical forms. And this gives rise to a geometrical form that I call the superchannel, which is kind of an inclusional version of superstring. Superstring theory basically is ignoring space still because it's stuck in that old logic. The superchannel is actually looking at the reciprocal flows, the flow and counterflow, yeah? And in particular, the funny thing about this is that when I worked out this particular geometry, what I produced was a double helix with triplets, which is kind of uncanny, scary. Because that's exactly the geometry of DNA. Anyway, so we move on. Space cannot be cut. It means that we have to think again carefully about our meanings of connectivity and continuity. If we're in the old logic, then continuity means all tied together, yeah? And we're imagining solidly connecting across gaps of space in a frozen field of total oneness. Okay? Now, in fact, that TV series yesterday, it actually really well handled the issue of holism. And it showed how that particular way of thinking was initiated in South Africa as a means of control.
Oh, can you say more?
No, not at this moment. But I would recommend you have a look at it to actually appreciate the fundamental origins of where holism itself arose, was through General Smuts in South Africa. And it gave rise to a particular form of governance. Okay, so let's just not dwell too long in that, but appreciate that in natural inclusionality, continuity is already there, because we have the continuity of space. Space is a pool in which we're immersed. Yeah? Space is not an absence that puts distance between us. Yeah? We're immersed in a pool of space. That pool has a receptive, inductive, if you like, loving influence. It draws into itself. Yeah? It draws energy to embrace around. And so when we arrive at this understanding, then the rigid rule of objective rationality melts into fluidly connected and redistributed energetic configurations of space that cannot be cut. We arrive at a flow geometry of nature, not a rigid, ice-bound geometry of nature. So this is one of my most iconic images, which is essentially giving expression to the idea that within all energetic form, at the heart of all energetic form, is space. This is what I call the heart of darkness, where we're understanding darkness in a new light. Yeah? Darkness is not evil. It is not what opposes life. It is what draws life into becoming. And so essentially this is what this image is all about, the drawing of life into becoming through the receptive gravitational influence, yeah, of inductive space, which is at the heart of all form. Ben will talk more about this shortly, because he will be talking about the very idea of a zero fractal, which is what this is an expression of. It means that in terms of understanding our own self-identity, we think of ourselves as cavities at heart, receptive places that draw energy into ourselves in the process of coming to life. And if you like, this is an image which expresses what I feel is the true symbolism of crucifixion, which is the taking of the vertical and the introduction of the horizontal as a means of bringing space, yeah, into the heart of the self. allowing the darkness to come within, not be banished to the outside in a stuck-up form. And so, and again it relates to the Hindu understanding of the elements. The four elements here, the four classical elements of air, earth, fire and water are represented here. But at the heart of those four is space, which is both at the heart or at the core, or at the 0 point of all, and everywhere else as well. So we have a different understanding of the nature of self-identity, where self-identity is now understood to be an inclusion of namehood, not an independent signal. We move between the sort of three views that I think characterize humanity, between the abstract, the supernatural, and the natural, if you like. So we live in a world at the moment dominated by abstract science, logic, and mathematics, which discounts the intangible presence as if it's nothing. Yeah? We have a common reaction to that hardline logic, which is essentially going to the other extreme. Is we don't like this hardline logic, so let's go all supernatural and essentially ignore the tangible presence as if it wasn't there. Okay, so that's what I call supernatural idealism. In between the two, just as dwelling in that place between the left and the right hemisphere, is natural inclusion of science, logic, or mathematics, which incorporates the intangible presence as a vital aspect of its very being, and is what actually enables it to come to life. So, scientifically, the huge scientific implication really is summarized here, I feel. We move from a fixed frame view of the world, in which geometry is used as a cold-hearted, ice-bound geometry, to a melted geometry view of the world, if you like. We move through the space barrier, recognizing that space is always continuous throughout any boundary. And we recognize the fundamental truth and importance of this phrase from Michael Pogliani as long ago as 1958. For once men have been made to realize that crippling mutilations, what a language. Once men have been made to realize that crippling mutilations imposed by an objectivist framework, once the veil of ambiguities covering up these mutilations has been definitely dissolved, many fresh minds will turn to the task of reinterpreting the world as it is, and as it then, once more, will be seen to be. The word once more alludes to the fact that indigenous wisdom has known this all along. So we have the basis for a scientific involution. We're thinking of space not as an exclusion from form, but as an inclusion of form. We're moving from the idea of separated space, time, matter and energy, or even separated space, time and matter energy, which is where Einstein got to an idea of place-time, where we're thinking about nature in terms of natural energy flow as an inclusion of space in form and form in space. We're thinking about evolution not by the elimination of the unfavored, but in terms of natural inclusion, as a co-creative, not an antagonistic process. Co-creative process in which each is influencing the other continuously. We require a new mathematics. That mathematics has been around since 1985, but hardly anyone knows about it. transfigural mathematics, invented by Leray-Cunliffe, whose core understanding is that space is continuous through boundaries. Transfigural means through the figure. Yeah? Space is continuous through the boundaries, and at the heart of every figure is zero. So we're all configurations of zero in infinite space, and we understand that the very idea of zero and infinity refer to spatial qualities, not material amounts. We arrive at the need to move from a rigid boundary logic of definition, of either or even both and thinking, to a fluid boundary logic of each in the otherness. We recognize the importance of both focus and circumspection, those two aspects of the divided brain. Yeah? We need both if we're not to get lost in the world. And to try to isolate one from the other is going to essentially make us lost one way or the other, both ways. So we need, if you like, the logic of the including middle, the middle path, the middle way that holds each in the influence of the other. We recognize that nature consists of distinct but mutually inclusive tangible and intangible presences. And we think of the world in terms of complementation, not opposition. Even aggression is a form of, I have no problems with the existence of aggression, inhibition, suppression, all these ideas. What I have a big problem with is the idea of any form of absolute opposition. Okay? Which is essentially where we're still, to my mind, currently stuck in the way that we think about the world and the way we think about ourselves and the way we think about evolution. So, that's it, as far as my little introduction is concerned. I think we probably ought to just have a little bit of a break now before we hand over to Ben, and maybe go and have some coffee down the corridor. How's that?
Sorry, can I just ask you something? Where does Rupert Sheldrake's field theory fit in? I mean, I'd just love to know what you think about it.
What I think about Rupert Sheldrake's field theory? I think it can be understood in terms of natural inclusionality, but it is not natural inclusionality because it actually arises from rational logic. Okay, and to my mind is on the edge of going to superstition, yeah, and not holding yourself in. For me, as a scientist, and for me, being a scientist means absolute humility. It does not mean arrogance. It means the absolute humility of requiring yourself to develop an understanding which is consistent with evidence, in other words, with our sensory experience of all kinds, and which makes consistent sense. Okay? It is not based on imposing some idea out of nowhere, yeah, and making everything fit that idea. It is about that really deep humility of trying to live in the world as best you can, as and with all the senses that you have available to you, yeah, to try to make sense of it. Now, I think that a lot of the sort of ideas that have arisen in a kind of opposition, to the abstract logic, yeah, have tended to flip over into that world. Well, what can we think of that would make nonsense of the abstract logic?
It's like a knee-jerk reaction. This is much of a knee-jerk reaction to rationalistic logic.
Yes.
As rationalistic is to religion in a way.
Yes.
It's the same.
So, and I will always admit my ignorance. It's very important, and I always will admit I can't possibly know about or haven't experienced. So that's all we can ever do, is we can only ever offer up, yeah, for consideration what comes from our experience and what makes sense to us. That's all we can do. And I think an awful lot of people don't do that. And in fact, the strange thing is the whole way of thinking with the W is based on the imposition of an abstract framework that doesn't exist, and for which there is no evidence, and that doesn't make sense. It makes paradox.
Alan, I have a question about the origin of matter.
I don't know.
It's back to the mystery. So the holding the mystery, but there is, the science of the cosmological material about the void, what comes from where.
Yeah.
But linked to that, I have a question which I did sort of raise by email a little bit. And want to pursue, maybe not now when we come back from coffee, is this question of the configuration of space.
Yes.
I can understand the configuration in space, but I find it harder to think of the configuration of space.
Well, it's language again. That's partly at issue here.
Yeah.
But I think of matter as a configuration of energy, and I think about energy as a configuration of space. Okay, and the of has a double meaning. Yeah, it means that the space configures. So the space is both outside and inside and throughout. Okay, so there's almost a deliberate ambiguity. Now, Einstein was on the way to this when he said we should not think about material objects as in space. Okay, in other words, objects surrounded by space. But as being spatially extended. Okay? Now, if you think about an object as being spatially extended, then the idea once again of the split between the inner world and the outer world goes. Yeah. So he was onto it. The trouble was, he sort of got a bit muddled, which is not kind of surprising.
I think he did it quite well, hadn't he?
Yeah, I think it doesn't not terribly surprising given the world that he was working in at the time. But
So the relation between the space and energy is at the heart of this.
it is. They're mutual,
And the nature of the receptivity.
Yes.
Why should space be receptive? I mean, is all the receptivity of that wall actually taken up by the space which is there?
Well,
And
space,
is it
because it has no resistance.
Yeah.
It is frictionless. Yeah, allows or permits movement into itself. If you like, let's think about a vacuum. Okay, vacuums suck. You're not supposed to say that in physics because physics is, doesn't want to have the idea of space having any kind of quality or presence. Yeah, and I remember being told off in my early physics lessons for talking about an Archimedean pump or whatever it was, and saying, yeah, well, it sucks the water up, doesn't it? And oh no, you mustn't call it like that. It means that it's an expression of the atmospheric pressure outside. But again, if you actually truly think of the Torricelli vacuum at the top of a barometer tube, yeah. Someone asked me, what is this intangible space? Well, effectively, that's what's in the Torricelli vacuum. But what's inside the Torricelli vacuum at the top of a barometer tube, that space is continuous with the space outside. And this question of the relative receptivity is all to do with the curvature of the interfacing, yeah, between the inner world and the outer world. And as you get smaller, that curvature increases towards infinity. Okay? And at that point, you begin to understand gravity.
I think part of the issue is the nature of infinity, and you get wrapped up in the idea of a space-time fabric which is infinitely folded. Whereas that isn't possibly exactly how things are. Space is a bit more than that, and infinity is a bit more than that. And I think there's a development book we'll talk about later on, which might wasn't going to go into it.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yep.
So if everything is in balance, if you think about a system that's not in balance, let's say you take away the hawks,
Yeah.
is it inevitable that if there are doves, there will be hawks?
In my thinking, yes, it is inevitable that there will be both hawks and doves, yes, in many ways. And the question of balance is very important. We're talking about a dynamic fluid balance here, which is very, very different, once again, from the kind of balance that was talked about in those programs I was watching yesterday, which is saying everyone, balance is not about stability, it's about instability, it's about fluidity. Yeah? But our thinking, or has been in the past, we thought about balance as what keeps everything stable. Yeah?
Right.
In inclusionality, balance is what keeps everything fluid. Yeah? So you're continually relating the inner with the outer. You're continually relating the tangible and the intangible. Yeah? And you've got a continually evolutionary system in that sense.
So it doesn't make sense to think about a world without hawks, because the minute there are no hawks, actually the world shifts into a different balance.
Exactly.
Space will look for
Exactly.
natural equilibrium and it'll create the whole. Why does space create matter? Because matter is part of the stability. And it's all part of this flow.
And you begin to understand that, once again, that hawks and doves aren't opposites.
Right.
They're complements in a deep sense. They're complementary. And the idea of trying to eliminate some aspect of the universe to make things better, to purify the universe, is one of the great problems that we have. The search for what will purify. I mean, ultimately, what objective rationality has tried to purify the universe of is space. So we'll try and understand everything purely in terms of matter. That's what materialism is we're trying to understand everything purely in terms of matter, because only matter matters. And we're scared stiff of the shadow, and we're scared stiff of space, because space is death, isn't it? Space represents the annihilation of the self. Yeah. And so the fear of death and the fear of darkness and the desire for certainty, are all part of what has given rise psychologically, in my mind, to the objectivist framework.
Good and bad's an interesting thing as well. I was sat on a sailing boat this summer with my dad and my uncle, and both of those guys have had things that you would consider to be bad happen to them in their lives. But we had a fantastic sailing trip, and both of those guys are having a brilliant time. And what's come out of the bad is actually far better than what they had before. And that's not always the case, but it's that human construct of good and bad, light and dark, and whether they really are different or actually just part of an equilibrium.
Okay, go on to
one thing, just let's say a quick example on evolution.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a long time ago that Darwinism doesn't work because there hasn't been enough time in the universe to get to where we are.
Right.
So this is the familiar thing of an object reacting to its environment.
Yeah.
Whereas this is completely the reverse, of course. Everything is changing
Yeah.
continuously. What are the implications? How do we understand why we have all this diversity? How's evolution? How do you see evolution?
I see evolution. I see evolution as the fluid, dynamic, co-creative transformation of all.
How do we get?
So, in other words, I see evolution as a co-creative process, incorporating both the tangible and the intangible in a continually shifting pool, if you like.
Is it inevitable from a Big Bang?
I don't believe in the Big Bang.
Oh, you don't?
This is really good.
I'm not sure that I believe in the Big Bang.
I'm with Alan on that one.
What's the option?
Well, when you
With the big swoosh.
the second half might help a little bit, to be
Okay.
honest. It's to do with zeroid, the 0 point in transfigural maths, and the sphere of influence of a 0 point or a zeroid. that just by its very presence induces more change. And the more you have together, the more change there is. And so time is not an absolute thing. You can't say, oh, the Earth's been around this amount of time, and so there's only been enough time for us to go stepwise this way. Because if you have a massive concentration of change, then the acceleration of that change is actually infinite within infinite reality. And so you can evolve very, very quickly with enough selection pressure.
Selection vacuum.
Inclusion of process.
If you create potential and space for change as selection vacuum, then the speed of evolution just carries on exponentially increasing. There is no absolute limit. The idea of a top speed or an absolute limit is all tied up with the idea of a start and an end, an edge, which is...
And time is even expressed in units, that include time, in terms of frequency. Again, there's so much paradox that is being generated by trying to split nature between material and non-material. And if you do that, if you start everything from... the simplest way of understanding it, which I often do, is to try to imagine what nature would be like if there was no space, if it was pure matter. And the answer, it would be a shapeless, sizeless point. And then you realise that shapeless, sizeless point is what the whole of objective rationality has tried to construct nature from. There's a set of shapeless, sizeless points. And if you try to imagine what the universe would be like without form, without matter, well, it would be formless. In other words, you'd have omnipresent space, and no distinguishable form. So it's almost impossible to escape the idea that form and space are mutually inclusive. And moreover, that if you understand form as intrinsically dynamic, not intrinsically rigid, that we're continually seeing form as a